lobe. It's going past the midbrain. It goes through the basal pons. It forms the medullary pyramids. How many times have I told you that? Cerebral peduncles, pons, medullary pyramids are all formed by upper motor neurons going down towards the spinal cord. All right? In the lower end of the inferior portion of the medullary pyramids, it's going to cross over. Remember on Tuesday I talked about the decussation, the crossing over? So 85% of these will cross over to the other side. 15% don't until they get to the spinal cord, and that's the anterior cortical spinal tract, which we're not going to talk about.
You said 85% crossover, you're referring to motor?
Yes, 85% of the cortical motor pathways will cross in the medulla. The other 15% cross when they get to so the other, okay, I just said I wasn't going to talk about it. The other 15 fibers that are motor come down on the same side and they cross over here to the opposite side. So 15% of them will do that. 85% cross over in the medulla, come down here and go into it on that side. But all of them eventually are crossed over. All right, so notice again, cerebral peduncles are formed of these upper motor neurons. Upper motor neurons, most of them will pass through the pons. Upper motor neurons form the medullary pyramids. They cross over, and in the spinal cord, they form the lateral cortical spinal tract. Okay? Where are they going to stop? In the anterior gray horn. The anterior gray horn is formed of the cell bodies of lower motor neurons. Make this follow the picture. I guess I should make this blue. So ventral root is formed of lower motor neurons. Ventral ramus is a mixture of our lower motor neurons and our first order neurons. Because the cell body is in our precentral gyrus, you know that this is under conscious control. Okay? You're actually making a conscious decision to innervate and contract or relax these muscles. So cortical bulbar goes just to the brainstem. Cortical spinal, same type of function. Voluntary control, but it goes down to the spinal cord. Now, if I were to create a lesion, let's say that same bleed that I had in the medulla. Let's say if I were to put that same bleed here. I would become paralyzed, wouldn't I? I would lose all voluntary function. Same side of the body or opposite side of the body? Opposite side of the body. It's supposed to go over to the other side. So sensory, and there's no real point in memorizing this. Just follow the pathway. In sensory, because my information's coming here, if I lose that function before it crosses over, then my loss of sensory is ipsilateral. If I lose it after it crosses over, it's contralateral. Okay? For motor, it's the reverse because I'm going to something rather than coming from something. So if I lose my pathway before it crosses over, it's now opposite side. Because I'm looking at where I'm going to. That's where I lose the function. So if this is going to innervate muscles on my left leg, and I lose that before it crosses over on the right side, it's contralateral. If it's already crossed over and I lose that function, then it's ipsilateral. Instead of memorizing that, just look. Here's where the lesion is. Here's where it's going to end up. opposites. Here's where the lesion is, here's where it's going to end up, same size. Okay? All right. The next two pathways, well, not quite the next two. We need to talk about our middle cerebellar peduncle. So remember why I said the pons was so swollen here? Because some of our descending fibers didn't go all the way down the spinal cord. They stopped, and they're scattered all through here, and their axons are going into the cerebellum. This makes the middle cerebellar peduncle. Now, how would you know that that was middle cerebellar peduncle and not the trigeminal nerve? Look at where it's going. It's stopping in the cerebellum. Whereas our trigeminal nerve goes out the pons. Okay? So the middle cerebellar peduncle is all of these fibers coming from pontine nuclei going to the cerebellum, and that's telling the cerebellum what I'm going to do. So here's the fibers going down. Now I showed them on opposite sides just to keep this clean. But there would be information over here as well. When I'm telling this side of the body over here what I'm going to do, this information is going to go to the cerebellum and say, here's this copy, like a blind copy in more ways than one. So there's the motor impulse to the muscle. Here's a blind copy to the cerebellum of what the muscle's getting. And that's the middle cerebellar peduncle. Okay. So if I had this as one of the 3 diagrams on the top of the page, and I asked you to identify the cell, pontine nuclei. Okay. Why are we calling it pontine nuclei instead of pontine ganglia?
It's in the brainstem?
It's in the brainstem. It's in the central nervous system. Okay? Okay, tectospinal tract. I used the word tectum this morning very briefly when I talked about the superior and inferior colliculi. Tectum means roof. The superior and inferior colliculi form the roof of the cerebral aqueduct. Notice that our upper motor neuron is not in the postcentral gyrus. This is that eyeball moving reflex that we've been talking about. Rather than a conscious thought triggering the upper motor neuron, it's sensory information coming from my thalamus that came from my eyeball. Something moved across my vision. I'm conscious, so I process that. But if I was unconscious and my optic nerve was working and my eyes were open, even though I was in a coma, that would still get to my thalamus. It would trigger this upper motor neuron, and it would go to my ocular motor nerve or my trochlear nerve, and that's where the lower motor neuron would be. And that would cause my eyeball muscles to move without conscious decision to do so. So this is skeletal muscle reflex. So the upper motor neuron is not in my cerebral cortex. Now, unless I told you that was superior colliculus, you can't tell from the picture whether it's superior or inferior. Okay? What's the inferior colliculus respond to?
Sound.
Sound. So I don't move my eyeballs and respond to sound reflexively. I might, what's that sound? And I look to see. But reflexively, I move my head so that my ear is facing the source of the sound. That requires neck muscle movements. So the upper motor neuron is going to go down to my spinal cord to where my neck muscles are. And then my lower motor neuron would move my neck if I was responding to sound. Okay? Sometimes I turn my head in response to I want to move my eyeballs. So I can turn my head in response to sound or sight, but I would turn my head in response to sound. So the upper motor neuron can be very short if it's going to eyeball nuclei, ocular motor, trochlear, abducens. The upper motor neuron would be long if it's going to neck muscles. But in this case, it's the upper motor neuron that's crossing over. It always is. It's not crossing over in the pyramid every time. How can you tell that this is a motor pathway? The descending pathway, and in the name, it's ending in spinal. So it's going down. Okay? One pathway left. So tectum spinal, if it starts in the tectum, and the tectum is either superior or inferior colliculus.
This is the one for moving your head to be closer.
Either eyeball or head. So if I hear a loud noise and all of a sudden I jerk my head, without consciously wondering what that noise is, I just turn my head, that's the inferior, and it has to have this long one going because I'm using my neck muscles to turn my head. I might turn my head for the sound, for the visual thing, or I might just turn my eyeballs. So it could be either or for superior colliculus. And I'm not going to get that picky.
The first order neuron would go to like a cervical vertebrae.
Right.
And trigger, the second order would trigger neck muscle.
The lower motor, not order, lower motor neuron. The upper motor neuron would go down to the cervical spinal cord, and then the lower motor neuron would go to neck muscles. From the anterior great horn. It's going to skeletal muscle, which you could voluntarily move, but this is a reflex movement that you would still do, or could possibly do if you were in a coma. Okay, so it's not involving cortex. If we do that movement involving, so the question is about the difference between this and cortical spinal. So I can move my head voluntarily. If I decide I want to turn my head and look, I'm going to be using this pathway. The origin of the upper motor neuron being in my precentral gyrus. If I'm unconscious and I turn my head because I hear a sound, I'm using this pathway. Okay? All right, the last one is rubros. Actually, we have one more, but we're getting one. Let's just stop here. We are supposed to end at 1:30, so I don't want to get too involved. We actually have two more rubrospinal and vestibulospinal, so we'll do those on Tuesday. Okay?
All right, we're good.